So thank you for inviting me. I try to make my talk as close as possible to your concern here, because it has to do with corporate interest. The paper behind is essentially a theory paper, which I wrote with François Bourguignon and Perrin Lefebvre, who are both from Paris School of Economics. But I met Perrin when he was a postdoc at the University of Namur. We started working together, and then François joined us. And we produced that paper, which I feel raises an extremely important question. And I will tell you a way that it can relate really to the title of this conference, Corporate Interest and Environmental Emergency in particular. It's quite possible to do. The issue that I have in mind is the following. Let's start about democracy. I think this was the last words of the previous session. Democracy and therefore political liberalization for countries which are not democratic. So usually it's said to be a good thing. It's good, why? Because you have the advantage of competition. So the arguments are essentially the same as for economic liberalization. Promote competition and the consumers will benefit. Promote political competition, the citizen will benefit. Why? Because the more you open the political floor, the more you have chance to find the right people that will respond to the demands of the people. When you restrict it, you may fall on the guys who is not the right guy. Okay. Another point is, if you have democracy and contest, then the politicians have an incentive to design programs that will appeal to the people so that they can get elected. And once they are in power, the incentive is to have a good quality performance. Why? Because they want to be re-elected. So that's the main argument, which looks so natural. Say, okay, so it's the same with firms. If they can compete together, they will try to be the best. They have the best quality for a given price, so that buyers will, the potential buyer will buy their product and will continue to do so. Okay. Now, when we see that and we look at the experience of developing countries, I must say that François and myself, we are development economists, so we have worked mostly on poor countries and developing countries. But if you look at the situation in developing countries today, and to some extent it's coming even to the West, you see a disenchantment with democracy. For instance, there is the problem of South Africa. A poll which is conducted in 2021 found that 2/3 of South Africans would be willing to give up elections if an unelected government will give them more life security, jobs, housing, etc. And recent polls, survey done by America's Barometer for the whole of Latin America show that the proportion is about 1/2. 1/2 of the people would be ready to say, to give up democracy in order to have more job security, in particular, better way of living, if that is the trade-off. Useless to say that, there are countries near to us that in which you find the same trend. Now, what has gone wrong? We have a beautiful theory saying open political competition should bring good results, and you find disenchantment in quite many countries. Okay? And in some countries, you see, like South Africa, we were talking about South Africa, you see that a man who has been heavily corrupt, Jacob Zuma, is now coming back to politics. And I'll give other hopeless example in a sense. Now, why are people disenchanted? Now, the first thing, and I won't spend time on it, because it's probably the most well-known, is, you can manipulate elections. You can tamper with democracy. You just take the last election in Russia. It's obvious. It's a fake election. The word election shouldn't be used. Because when you have an autocrat who can decide who can run for election and who cannot, obviously you are tampering with the result. So you can manipulate the result, you can manipulate the electoral list, you can stuff the voting box. These are kind of open, disgracious, you could say, way of manipulating democracy. So the answer is to say, okay, let's not talk that democracy, this is something else. Semi-autocracies or whatever, your apparent democracy, captured democracy as they are called in the literature more and more. So, okay, I don't want to talk about that. No, I want to talk about another problem. So, no, let's assume that people, they just vote in normal conditions. Everybody can compete. No one is barred from being elected. So people vote freely. There is no stuffing of box, etc. But there is another difficulty, is that there is the issue of campaign financing. And the issue of campaign financing means that people who are rich enough can influence election by giving money to some candidates. The candidates that they prefer. Okay? So, this is the issue of campaign financing. You know that in sophisticated democracies like European democracies, there are rules. There are rules capping the amount of contribution that can be made from business, in particular, to politicians. And so you can say, okay, that's right. In order to have a fair democratic rules and equality of the change of the candidate, you should, in fact, regulate the amount of campaign financing. It is done, there are laws, and these laws, we try to enforce them. Witness to it in France, the fact that Sarkozy is in difficulty because he has, in fact, violated the capping, the amount, the maximum amount that was allowed for financing his election has been multiplied by 2, and he is in the court for that, and still at risk of getting even a jail sentence. Okay? No. In developing countries, some countries have also this kind of laws capping or banning the financing of political parties, but one thing is sure, is that they are never properly enforced. So it is also assumed that in all the developing world, there is no law limiting campaign contributions to politicians. Okay, and so the whole question that we have in this paper is, okay, then let's call that into question and assume that, in fact, businessmen can freely sustain, support the political candidates they want. Do you still find that democracy, in the sense of opening political competition, is a good thing? And in fact, we measure that by saying, we want to see the impact of campaign financing on the relationship between political competition and corruption. And by corruption, we mean state capture. By businessmen, we mean that, in fact, who is behind the policy that are decided by the government. That's exactly what we have in mind. And in fact, the idea of doing that came from a project in which François and me have been involved for 10 years, which was funded by the British Minister of Cooperation in a number of case studies that we did in Africa and Asia. And where, in the end, we found that a major problem was that behind the government, there were businessmen. So the businessmen were really capturing the political power. And the key mechanism is campaign financing. So it's a huge issue. In the first presentation we had, it was presented as belonging to the material structure. I wouldn't put that way. I would say, no, this is the weapon in the hands of the business oligarch to be the hidden agent, to retake the same terminology, the hidden agent behind politics, okay? No, there are suggestive supporting evidence. For instance, a paper by Jomo and Gomez in 1997 was for Malaysia, who shows this, who said that. It doesn't really show, but still, it's an historical narrative showing that when the UMNO, the United Malays Organization Party, which is a really dominant party, became more fragmented. So there was more political competition within that party, but it influenced the whole country. Then the role of Chinese businessmen became more important. And there was more control of the whole politics by the Chinese businessmen. Okay. Now, in Ghana and Kenya, to another example, there is also this idea that when there was political liberalization, immediately you see more meddling of businessmen into the political sphere. And in fact, in our own survey, we have seen that in the case of Mozambique, there have been at a certain time a drastic reduction of political competition under the impact of one man. I'll come back on that man later. So there's more limited politician. Then you see immediately that campaign contributions have been reduced and that corruption has been reduced as well. For a while. Okay. Now, so obviously, we want to frame the argument in the following way, which is a simple supply and demand argument that even non-economists can understand. On one side, you have businessmen who is there with their money and would like to give money to people whom they can buy. On the other hand, you have politicians who want that money to finance their political campaign. And so we are arguing that in some way or other, the bargaining power of the businessmen should be the higher, the fewer are the businessmen compared to the politicians. If you have a lot of businessmen offering money and few politicians will be in a very good position to tame the businessmen. But if you have only a few oligarchs, let's call it that way, or tycoons, but you have plenty of politicians who would like to have their money, and they are in a strong bargaining position. And so came our idea of let's put that in a theory, but really a strict formalized theory where we define state capture as the occupation of power by a corruptible politician who is ready to sell political favors to the business sector after election, if they are elected, of course. Then the risk of state capture is the probability that a corruptible politician, as defined before, comes to power. And the business people make campaign contribution. They optimally choose and fix the amount that they give because they are free. There is no amount that is imposed on them. And that, of course, we assume that the amount that they pay influence the probability that a corruptible politician that they have supported win the election. Okay? That sounds quite reasonable as assumption, and we work on that basis to try to see what's happening, what is happening in this circumstance. Okay, now poor countries are of special interest because enforceability of law banning or capping business contribution is very low, and owing to the low accountability of the government action, the magnitudes of the rents that are there ready for capture by the businessmen are large because there is no transparency and etc. Okay. Now, I will not go into the main findings now because I think they will be a bit difficult to comprehend. So let me first go to the literature, then go to the empirical material coming from case study we had on 3 countries, and then tell you in a nutshell, in fact in 2 diagrams, what we say, what we can say and show that the theory tells us. Okay. The only thing I can announce is that the theory can show that if you politically liberalize in the presence of campaign financing, which is not regulated, then you should expect, at least for a while, in some very important conditions, that corruption will increase in the sense of the capture of the state by business. Okay? Now, before entering into my example, I would like to make a relationship with the topic of this conference. Now, let's just assume that the business oligarchs, they don't want climate change measures because they are costly to them and they are bothered by it. So they look for politicians that we call corruptible in our vocabulary, that are just people who are ready to be elected on the basis of this campaign contribution and to enact policy measures that are not going into the directions of struggling against climate change. Okay? That perfectly fits the model. You just define corruption in terms of, trying to influence the environmental policies of the government by businessmen who don't want them. Okay? Now you could say there are those one, they were okay. They are not there for the time being, we assume that. And then everything that I show after, you can just transpose it to the environmental problem here. It's perfectly fit. Now, if you look at the empirical literature in general, you see that for a reason that has been already mentioned, that it is extremely difficult to have information about business politician deals. Why? Because they are secret. And in a sense, all the materials that we have are either the result of public investigations that have been decided, let's say, by a government. The British government into the wealth of some Russian oligarch in London, for instance. Or what the Belgian government has just done for a number of MPs at the European Parliament, really in regard of the money they got from Qatar government to defend the interest of Qatar. You know, then you have material. Or the other circumstance in which you can have material is when some parties to the obscure deal, you know, don't like the way it is going, and bitter tensions are raising within the people who collude, and they go to court in order to settle that problem. Then you have the court proceedings. That allows you to have an idea about how it works. I give two examples here in the literature. The book of Davisha on Putin, Russia, that shows with extreme precision going into court proceedings, essentially published in Geneva and London, how the deals about, for instance, food delivery by the European community to Russia has been swindled by Putin in Petersburg, and the way it has been then placed as money in tax havens. So we have a lot of information of the mafia around Putin coming from this book of Davisha. It's entirely based on court proceeding coming from the Western country and the Russian press, which under Yeltsin was quite free and could publish a number of these results. And then there is another paper which I found very interesting, De Carolis, for the role of the mafia in Italy. It is also well documented on the same basis. Okay. Now, given this limitation of the case for which we are well informed, there are a lot of effort in a very recent literature. When I say recent, it's the last 10 years, no? So it's very fresh literature, which in a sense, 10 to 20 years, try to first to look at the value of political connection for business circles, you know, and try to measure it and give figures and I give you of course by far the most important literature for the US, as always, but there is also some others for Indonesia, that equity, Pakistan, France, England, Panama, etc. Okay? Now, what are the benefits from state capture for the business circle? Getting public contract, getting special grants and subsidies, favorable policies, here comes our example for climate change, preferential treatment for bank loans, and protection from prosecution or punishment. Okay, those are the many legal advantages for which they try to give figures and to estimate the value of state capture for business people. Now, here, just to quote two very nice papers, one for Pakistan by Asim Khwaja and a co-author. He shows that political firms that are defined as those whose director has participated in an election borrow 45% more and have 50% higher default rates than other firms. And preferential treatment occurs in government banks only, not in private banks. Which means that private banks are independent, rather independent from the hold of the politicians. Okay, moreover, political rent increase with the strength of the firm's politician and whether his party is in power or not. So all that goes into the direction of our intuition, right? No, another paper is on India and showed that the share of public road contractors whose name matches that of the winning politician increased by 83% in the term after a close election compared to the term before. And cost of road construction is increased as well as the likelihood or the probability that some go missing, which means that, you know, the budget has been stolen and public investment has not been carried out. In Brazil, to have a last example, firms which provided campaign finance enjoy higher returns after the election of the candidate whom they have supported. Okay? So that's one current of the strand of the literature. Another strand of the literature is, in fact, about the link between campaign spending and the probability of the candidate who is supposed to be elected, right? And also the kind of policy that he is enacting after having been elected. Here, there is a massive number of studies, massive, really, especially for the US, because in the US it's easy to do, because what you do, you say, okay, these legislators, who has been elected, how much money did he get in his campaign? All these figures are supposed to be published. And what kind of policy did he enact when a vote came in the Congress, in fact, when a policy discussion took place? What is the policy stand he took? Is it influenced by the kind of business that he was influenced for? Which is exactly the discussion we had just before. Okay, and the link is very clear. All this is very confirmed. There is a link. A candidate that has more money is more likely to be elected. And if he is elected, then he's more likely to follow the policy that really matches the interest of the people who have supported him. So there is no big surprise, but still, it's good to show. Okay, now, there are two papers we go exactly in the topic I was mentioning. Yeah, but what about the impact of political competition? Then we have this paper on Benin that I was mentioning. We show that when you reduce competition, you have less corruption and less campaign financing, less meddling of business with political interest. And another paper about Italy that shows that political reform in 1991 that led to an intensification of political competition increased the candidate's demand for support by the mafia. Okay? Of course, here you can think of the 90s, it was Berlusconi was very strong, and there was a lot of competition within the party of Berlusconi and around it, and the role of the mafia in financing the Italian election increased. Okay, now let me talk about three case studies I want to draw attention. Now, first, I have a small preamble, which is the following. To say, let's think of a benchmark which is an autocratic state, but a nice autocratic state in the sense that the leader is benevolent. He really thinks so, and competently about his country, and he's strong in the sense that he's immune to the private interest of the business circles. Okay? And honestly, he does. Then there are two countries that come to mind. One is Taiwan, and the second is South Korea. These are two countries which at the time of their early development, which means post-Second World War, had a very autocratic regime, but completely autonomous vis-à-vis private interest. For instance, in Korea, the country was really, the policy-making direction of the country was really led by the Economic Planning Board. The Economic Planning Board was stuffed with high-level technocrats, very competent people, and they really did the policy, and business circle had no voice, to decide about the policy. It was imposed by a strong, you could say even military regime. In Taiwan, it was the same. If you look at the representation of the business milieu, whatever it is, there was no big enterprise there. It was more medium and small-scale enterprise. They had no representation at the level of policymaking. Who made the decision? It was high-level bureaucrats, very well chosen for their competence, under the direct sway of first Chiang Kai-shek, and there is his two successors, right? And this autonomy worked well, in fact, for the country, and they liberalized politically much later when they gained legitimacy because they brought economic performance. Okay, now, I have 8 lessons, and I think I will have to, not to go into too much detail here, but when we look at our 3 case studies for Africa, which is Benin, Tanzania, and Mozambique, what did we find on the specific topic, I was talking about? 8 lessons. First lesson, in the ideal case, political liberalization is sparked by rising popular pressure in the context of a rapidly developing economy. That's the case I've just mentioned, Taiwan and South Korea, in the late 80s. But in many poor countries, and in all the countries we have studied, the trigger for political liberalization, and in fact, also economic liberalization, has been the collapse of a strongly authoritarian state which was incompetent, which in fact brought an immense political crisis, and then under the pressure of international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and bilateral donors, they had to change their system. They were forced to adopt multi-party democracy in the early 1990s. In all these cases, the regime was not only authoritarian military, but was Marxist or Marxian, whatever you call it. So it was really in favor of strong centralization and nationalization of all assets, okay? Now, second lesson, when political liberalization occurred, it went hand in hand with a growing role of business oligarch, which played a big role in campaign financing, okay? Capture of the state followed. Third lesson, if political liberalization is associated with the rise of inter-party competition in the framework of multi-party election, it may also take another form that have been hardly studied, which is inter-faction competition within a dominant party. So those 2 forms are possible, and we argue it doesn't matter whether it is one or the other for the theory we want to have. 4, when political liberalization yields genuine inter-party competition, a proliferation of parties may follow. For instance, in Benin, in 10 years, less than 10 years' time, the number of political parties competing for election after political liberalization rose from 35 to 240. Can you imagine? 240 political parties. So a completely split landscape that has been described as anarchic multipartism. In all cases, because of course this is unmanageable, what you had is coalitions taking place to regroup these parties under the headship of some powerful man. Now, coming back to the second form, where intra-party is the most important form of political competition, as we found for Tanzania and Mozambique, not for Benin. Then we find that political liberalization creates a change of the rules that is fundamental. Because, imagine before, you are under the CCM. CCM is the dominant party in Tanzania, led by Julius Nyerere, who was the leader of the anti-colonial movement, one independent man with an immense charisma, very popular, so people always voted for him because he was so popular, like Fidel Castro in Cuba a bit. But within the party, there were factions representing various ethnic group, region, etc., but he controlled it. And the problem is that any leader or bigwig in the party, political bigwig, had no exit option. Because if he would not abide by what Nyerere said, he will be expelled and his political career will be ended. When political liberalization came, these people who were competing within the party, but who were disciplined by the leader, in this case Nyerere, they thought, no, we could form our own party. And if there are businessmen who are helping us, who are willing to help us, why not accept this money, which would have been impossible before? And so that's what happened. And in a sense, political liberalization, even though the CCM was always winning the election, was creating a lot of entry of oligarchs. It doesn't mean that if I want to get power within the CCM after Nyerere, I will leave the party and make another one. I can. But it happens that because, I can stay here, but I have my oligarch, and in the primary election within the party, who will decide who will become, in the end, the president, if I have stronger oligarchs, then I have better chance to win. No, a sixth message, windfall state incomes by increasing appropriable rents, enhance the incentive of business oligarchs to provide campaign finance. Obviously, this is the case in Mozambique after the discovery of oil and gas reserve in Cabo Delgado, where the corruption has increased a lot and the intrusion of businessmen. 7, the relationship between oligarchs and politicians are plagued by a commitment problem, that politicians may not stick to their promise they made to business sponsor. We document that, especially for Benin, but I have no time to go into more detail. And 8 is an important one, that in conditions of high political uncertainty, a powerful oligarch may overstep the border between politics and economics or business and become the president himself. So you have the example of Patrice Talon, whom we study in depth in Benin. You have the example of Saakashvili in Georgia, of Cartes in Paraguay, and Petro Poroshenko in Ukraine till 2019. Okay, now I have no time, with the limited time I have, to go into the detail of the experience of this country. So what I want to show you is a result of the theory. Without a single equation, I will just want you to trust me about the final outcome. Here, what we measure is the number of political candidates. So what you measure along the horizontal axis is the intensity of political competition, measured by the number of people who compete. And what you measure along the ordinal axis, the vertical axis, is the probability that a man who is corruptible, rise to power, right? Or that a man who doesn't want to implement, doesn't believe in climate change, rises to power, if you want to put it in the terms of this conference. No, if you don't have the possibility of campaign financing, we find that the probability of having state capture is decreasing with political competition. This is the curve that you see there, below the dotted line. So that confirms the standard view. If there is no problem with business meddling, because they cannot, for one reason, any reason that you think, for instance, there is a law that is effectively enforced, capping or preventing businessmen to intervene, then more competition you have, the better it is to reduce the risk of state capture. No, what happens if no businessmen can enter into the picture and they can come with campaign financing to support their candidate? Then you find that up to a point, the risk of state capture increases. And below a maximum, beyond the maximum, then it starts decreasing. And when competition is very, very high, then it is reduced. But unfortunately, because you could say, okay, it's less tragic than we could think. Okay, but in fact, the problem is that if the rents available to the government are large, then this curve is moving to the right. So you need more competition to reach the maximum. So Cabo Delgado is a good example. If you have a lot of oil, mineral wealth, etc., then the risk of state capture is much bigger and can start. You would need a lot of competition to prevent it. And then you could say, yeah, but that explains why all the countries which are more corrupted in the sense that you will find, for instance, in Africa, are those who are rich in mineral wealth, in oil, etc. That's completely predicted by your model, right? And then I have to add, this assumes that businessmen and politicians act independently. But no, assume that under the impulse of a businessman, politicians unite and collude, in fact, as happened in Benin under the impulse of Patrice Talon, who is now has become the autocratic leader of the country, then the curve is no more descending. It's always rising. And this is also true if we assume that there are firms, and this I will end up on that because I have 1 minute, this is exactly what I mean. Now, I have the dominant curve here, where, without saying I've assumed that there is only one oligarch. No, I assume that there are plenty. You have economic liberalization. You don't have a state planning board deciding everything. And in a sense, what matters is the following. That you see the red curve is worse than the black curve because the risk of state capture is much higher. And you would like to know, when does that happen? When there is a lot of competition between businesses. Okay? And it happens also when they know that the commitment problem with politicians is rather well solved, that they know they will stick to their promise. Then they are very much incited to finance the campaign of the politicians. And then you have a high risk of state capture. No, the blue curve is much more hopeful in the sense, because it is running against the tendency of policy capture, of state capture by business people. When does it happen? When firms are not that in competition with each other. And when they don't feel they can rely on the promise of the politician. That's the best scenario. But what does it mean? It means something really interesting. When is it that business firms are less in competition with each other? When the economy is more diversified. So everyone has his own niche, and in fact have complementary activity in a variety of sectors. Then you would say, this is the time. Yeah, but the problem is that economic diversification, you don't reach it in 1 day or one week. It takes time. Then we have a whole rationale for what South Korea and Taiwan did. It is only when the economy was sufficiently diversified so that there was not much rivalry between competing business interests that they decide to politically liberalize. And in a sense, you could say they did it at a time when, in fact, it was not damaging in terms of state capture. In a sense, the country was ready for democracy and political liberalization. Before it was not. And then it was staying but not fully competent totally. So that's the main lesson that we draw. And again, you can assume the same thing for the environmental emergency. You can translate it in the way I was proposing in the beginning.
Thank you very much. So we see that one of the major points, pillar of the Washington Consensus is actually, which was privatization, decentralization, and democratization, was in many cases giving the hand to the oligarch. Yeah. So thank you. Do we have questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. I have a lot of questions, but I will ask only one here. On your last slide, you argue that when the economy becomes more diversified, it allows corruption to be lower, and so competition between businessmen is higher. But isn't it a matter more of wealth concentration? Because we have a lot of examples of businessmen who have interest in many different areas of the economy. And so diversification is perhaps not the perfect condition to allow that. It would be more a low level of wealth inequality.
Now I have to think about your question. I think the results hold that even if there is a lot of diversification within a business firm, still the argument will hold. that the diversification by itself will reduce the incentive or the interest the businessman has to try to capture the state. That the worst case is when everybody wants to have the same, a protection that is at the expense of another firm. That's the worst case, because then everybody would like to give more campaign financing to his own politician to counter the interests of the other. That's why. Whether if a business is integrated with diversification, it's almost the best case, because he internalizes, all the costs. But I have to think more. But I would think it goes into that direction.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Yes.
Why do the risk of state capture decreases beyond a certain level of political competition? Did you explain it? Or?
No, I did not. So since you raised the question, I will answer it, of course, because it is important. In fact, if you have an upturn or a downturn, as you have here, it's because there are two effects. And during the first part, one effect dominates the other, and above a certain point is the opposite. The other effect dominates. Now, what are these two effects? The first effect that we call the competition effect is if you have only one person, imagine one candidate, is either corruptible or not. So the probability of state capture is reflected by the proportion of corruptible people among the politicians. Either you get the right one or not the good one. We start from there. Then after you increase the number of politicians. But then the probability that suppose you have only one corruptible person, but no, you have 2 or 3 or 4. No, you have an increasing probability that non-corruptible people will come out to the scene. Then the interests of the firms are endangered. They are threatened because they say, oh no, there is a chance that a guy whom I cannot corrupt rises to power. Then his incentive to pay for campaign, to influence the vote, increases, to try to avoid that possibility which goes against his interest. But that goes only up to a point, because there is also a dilution effect that makes your contribution less and less important vis-à-vis the political weights of the candidates. And now here I have to spell out an assumption that is key, and is quite reasonable, so it doesn't invalidate the exercise, is that we assume that the political weight, you forget about campaign finance, the political weight of non-corrupt people is higher than the political weight of corruptible people. In the sense that in a vote contest, people, the majority of the people, because you can say you have talk only about business people. Yeah, but the people are there, they would like to have the non-corrupt people. So they have more political weight. Now, what you can show is that if you increase the number of political candidates, your contribution, your final contribution, will become less and less important compared to the political weights of the politician, which is in favor of the non-corrupt people. Okay? In fact, if you tell me, no, the population like corruptible people, then you have to invert the whole reasoning. Is to say that if that is the case, the probability will always be bad. The argument will be inverted. But it's not very reasonable. The interesting case is to think of businessmen going against the interest of the majority of the population. That's what we would like to say for environmental regulation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Oh. Yeah, it's time for lunch, so you may talk during the lunch, please.